Hello and welcome to episode 20 of A is for Architecture with me, Ambrose Gillick. I'm talking today with Professor Alan Powers about modernism in architecture, reflecting on a provocative wee essay he wrote for a magazine for Reba Friends of Architecture, The Allure of the Impure, and his 2014 book, written with Tim Britton-Catlin and Tom Dykov, 100 Years, 100 Buildings, published by the 20th Century Society in Batsford.
I gained some sort of optimism from the fact that the star architects were around 20 years ago. Don't really count for very much anymore. And, they may have had something going for them, but they were so overinflated. I think the conscience of architects reawoke within the same period, but with very different results. And perhaps merely reviving an older Puritanism. But I'm more hopeful about where we are now, actually, and the social engagement of architects that has been a feature of some earlier periods has actually kind of found its locus.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome again to A is for Architecture. I'm talking today with Alan Powers. Alan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, I'm not an architect, but I somehow can't keep away from the subject. I grew up in a house with quite a lot of architecture books in it, and my father was an architect, and he told me not to be one. So I have gone through my life alternately taking an interest in it as a historian, conservationist, and teacher, and sometimes trying to get away from it.
Why do you think your father told you not to become one?
Well, he was quite explicit about it, actually. He said the part that you think you will enjoy is actually such a very small part of the whole thing. And the rest is really quite dreary. And I can't remember his exact words, but I think he's intuited I was not the right personality type. I think the reality is I could have studied architecture and gone on to do a great deal of what I have done without the inconvenience of putting up any buildings. Although I think I would have been quite good at that.
Yeah, I imagine you would. So where did you study? What did you study and where?
What did I study? I studied art history, and I did it at Cambridge, and it was good from that point of view. The architecture side of that course was strong. I didn't do that uniquely. I mixed it with other courses about painting, really. And then I went on to do a PhD on the history of architectural education, which I think, knowingly or not, was a sort of substitute for actually undergoing it. But the period I looked at was up to 1914 in Britain. And it was also an attempt to get at a sort of history of ideas. Ideas were rather thin on the ground in that period. But because there was a big discussion about how to train architects, really for the first time in a systematic way, they had to try and articulate what they thought mattered. So I think it was interesting from that point of view.
You mean ideas were thin on the ground?
Well, British architects didn't do theory, basically, is what it comes down to. Or only a few of them did. The few who did actually were involved in the education debate. So I kind of netted them through this selection, like W.R. Netherby, for example.
Has architecture transformed significantly? Are we? Because my gut feeling is that architecture and ideas still have this rather uncomfortable, architectural practice and ideas still have this rather uncomfortable relationship where the theorist or philosopher or historian is held in a slight lower position, shall we say, or their ideas are not seen as being rooted in reality and therefore dismissible.
Well, possibly quite rightly. But I think something interesting happened after the Second World War. My father's generation, they read books, but they didn't take ideas seriously in the way that the generation of Alan Cahoon, Colin Rowe, and various other writers, Kenneth Frampton, and so on, they did, and that became their main activity. Really, was analysing, in the case of most of those figures, analysing what the modern movement of the previous generation had really been about, rather than what those people said it was about, and trying also to root it more deeply in a historical past, I think, and in some cases to reach more universally applicable concepts about things like typology, for example.
So, so we've seen, I think, an ascent an ascent of theory in architecture. Is that directly linked to the emergence of modernism? So if the early 20th century is still tied very much to kind of Victorian stories about architecture, is theory and modernism, are they intimately linked? Is that
No, I don't think they are, actually. I think the kind of theory that I'm describing here, which has a degree of detachment to it, it's not what's called operative theory. It's more like postmodernism, really. It's after the event, when the dust has more or less settled, you stand back and you look at it. And some of it has gone on to be quite operative in a number of ways, in quite good ways, perhaps. It's broadened how architects are trained, certainly, and therefore they have these words and these ideas. What they do with them is a bit of another matter. And there are a lot of schools where they kind of half learn them, in my experience, and don't really know what to do with them.
Can you give an example of some of these theoretical positions? I mean, you mentioned Colin Rowe, Fred Coater's Collage City. Is this the kind of thing you're talking about, where you're starting to look at architectural forms and examples and sort of reverse engineering their meaning and purpose?
I suppose that's partly it, and there's the whole sort of area of architectural affect, word that's come in recently, which phenomenology relates to, that you have to have very kind of refined feelings and responses, and you write about your own buildings, in some people's cases, in those terms, and you expect people to experience those feelings. And the whole thing becomes very heavy and serious. And we've had quite a lot of that. I mean, there have been other things as well, of course, and the sort of linguistics aspect of it. My feeling in the end is that it's peripheral to whether the work is really good or not. And many really good architects never kind of got involved in that. Or if they did, I think James Stirling's a very interesting case. He did write quite a lot, particularly in his earlier years. And it's very good. But when he dealt with clients or with the press, he was absolutely stuck to facts and explained a building in terms of how it would work, how it would do what the client wanted. The rest he kept up his sleeve, although there was a lot there. I don't know which is preferable. I think, there was an element of denial in that, I'm only going to tell you about the bit that works. And certainly when people swallowed that, they missed the point, particularly about, in a way, the first phase of modernism, which claimed to be an efficient, functional solution to specific problems. And it never was. That wasn't ever what it was about. But I think they didn't dare say what it really was, which was, having a great time with shapes and a sort of quasi-surreal fantasy, really, creating something that would transport you imaginatively into another world.
Very interesting idea. I mean, I like this idea of to go back to what you were first saying, this idea of architecture as I was in one of the previous episodes of this series that I'm recording now with Liam Gillick. He was talking about how at the Venice Architecture Biennale, he was looking at the stuff from this year and the claims that have to be made by architects about the agency and efficacy of their work. He said are sort of impossible to support by the architecture. The architecture could never possibly do that. And I suppose what Sterling is, in a way, insulating himself from, but also probably through humility, perhaps, the recognition of his own reach, is that if you don't make claims about stuff, you can let the building do its own talking in a way, can't you?
Yes, I mean, it's the odd thing that many figures have felt they need to combine these two activities, which don't have to be linked.
No.
And Alison and Peter Smithson, I've read a lot of their writings, and I think they laid themselves open to accusations of being pretentious at the very least, or preposterous. When I got very involved in the argument over whether or not Robin Hood Gardens should be preserved, their writings were really one of the major liabilities.
Because they claimed too much for it.
They did, yes. It was all well-intentioned, but they were a bit arrogant. And, nobody should have predicted that in quite such a determinist way, if we design it like this will happen.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. But I want to come back to this idea of modernism as so obviously part of your expertise lies in your writing and research around modernism. And I suppose it confuses people a little bit because it's a derogatory term for most people and a term of high praise for architects, and certainly in the academy it's a term of high praise. But what do you mean by modernist architecture? I mean, playfulness or seriousness, monolithicness? There's various.
I've always been quite keen to open up rather than close down the definition. I'm not even sure that there's a valid category there. It's defined largely by negatives, architecture that does not work in a recognizable historical style, although we now know how much history is concealed within it, and that's unavoidable, really. You can't reinvent everything. It's had the idea of being technologically driven, but actually so have lots of other architectures been. I don't think that is its most distinctive attribute. Perhaps the most convincing bit of the definition, I think, is its affinity to early 20th century abstract art movements and what they offered or what they prohibited, and the way that ideas about figuration were quite largely eliminated, often very excitingly. I mean, it was something that absolutely had to happen. What is odd is that 100 years later, we're still obsessing over it.
Yes. So the article you sent me, the allure of the impure, nice tongue twister, from the Friends of Reba Architecture journal. So terrific little essay that you wrote, really interesting, and challenges a lot of the ideas that I think our students of architecture are taught to think of when they think of modernist architecture, and perhaps is the idea that's held in the public imagination, which is, generally speaking, as you say, something to do with technology, strip windows, I'm just thinking back to the essays that I have to read by students on
please don't.
how do you define how do you define modern architecture. But it's the modernist thing is also tied into a political language. So if it's tied into the art language, it's also the art movement is tied into a kind of new political and social cultural vision, isn't it? One that's
so many of them hoped.
Mm-hmm.
I find that possibly the least convincing in the cold evidence of it, that it was operative to that effect and to no other. I mean, partly this is because, as you just said, the great majority of people, didn't like it very much, and the argument was, well, they will eventually when they can see the whole thing, the whole proper thing, and they still didn't. They liked it even less, I think, and that's still the case. And I don't think it's just in this country. I mean, we are exceptionally obtuse and conservative, but I think in a more widespread way, it offers default positions on a number of things, and people who diverge from it make it worse in a lot of ways. So, it's a kind of safety position to some extent.
Yeah.
But where am I going with this? Referring back to the article, it's part of a developing thinking that I have, part of which is that architecture, as it's been happening in recent years, opens different doors on the past or different windows. And we can validate and see buildings that were probably not seen as very important, or were seen as a bit weird, and recognize in them something really interesting in terms of its potential. And one I put in that article I've often referred to, which will be known to people who know London reasonably well, is the former St Martin's School of Art in Charing Cross Road, which had become a very sort of grubby building and nobody looked at it, I think. And then it was cleaned and converted into Foyle's bookshop and various other uses up above. And I thought, this is absolutely stunning. It's kind of tough. It has integrity. It has decoration, but not too much. The decoration's in the right place. And, you cannot classify it. It is a real hybrid. And, it does a series of things with materials and forms that, to me, are, have great rich potential for being taken further.
Yes, I like the way you describe that building as almost possibly offering a kind of indigenous modernity, an indigenous modern form which features, as you say, a kind of a richer palette of languages and styles, and decorative patterns, not least, which is quite an important part. Because if we're going to go back to this definition of modernism, I think most people would also see it as something that lacks decoration, that the kind of influence of the high modernists stripping away of the accretions of Victorian chintz perhaps its defining character, and that actually what you're seeing in the old Foyle's bookshop is actually an alternative modernity, an alternative modernism, which could have done something else.
Yes, it's not too late, and it's not unique either. There are other examples. It just happens to be a rather good one, and so fascinating that there it was all the time, and we didn't really see it.
Why didn't we see it? I think that's a really important question. Why has the practice of theory and the establishment of architecture failed to recognize these?
Well, that is a good question. When I say we didn't see it, I didn't see it. I'm still not convinced that anybody else has seen it, in spite of my best efforts to promote it. And that's been a very slow journey, I would say. And a lot of the work I've done in research and publication has been about figures who were thought to be maybe amusing, but really not important, and a bit obscure. When I was an undergraduate, slightly by chance, I did a dissertation on Harry Stewart Goodhart Rendell, who was a figure many people had heard of, but more as a writer and lecturer than as an architect. And his buildings were quite widely published up to the Second World War. After that, he was so out of fashion that virtually nothing got into print. So I set off and discovered these churches that had been done at that point less than 20 years previously, which I thought were absolutely stunning, using decorative brick in a very sophisticated way. And, I know he was trying to sort of chart out this alternative territory where you could design in a more decorative way, but with a discipline. And so that stayed with me, really. What he talked about. He had a very interesting thing he wrote about a much older architect than him, John James Burnet of Glasgow, whose practice went on and did a huge amount of work in London and elsewhere, Burnet, Tate and Lorne. And he said he met Burnet when he was young and asked him why he designed buildings in different styles. And what Burnet explained was that style really didn't matter. All that mattered was it was appropriate and you did it well. Apart from that, there was no reason why you shouldn't do, one style here and another one there. And that is so different to certainly the way that modernists were trained to think that style was a dirty word, you shouldn't refer to it even. And what Goodhart Rendell realized, I think, was how much fun you can have with it, whether it's historical, which he was very good at doing, or whether it's really kind of sui generis that he could put patterned brickwork on a steel frame and show how the Victorians would have done a modern building.
Funnily enough, how they did do modern buildings in places like New York and Chicago, strangely enough.
Somewhat more so, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I know his church, Holy Trinity at Dockhead. The book that I was research assistant on for Bob Proctor, was one of the churches I went and photographed and looked in the archives for. And it is a terrific piece of design. And he was a fantastically didactic man. As far as I know, he was involved in the petitions against the designs, post-war designs for Our Lady of Victories in Kensington and every time I try and remember architects' names, my mind goes entirely blank. But it was designed in a neo-Gothic, fairly authentic Gothic fashion, but with these strange hairpin.
Isn't that by one of the Scots?
Yes, it was by one of the Scots. It was the grandson, who and I liked Our Lady of Victory. I thought Adrian Gilbert Scott, and I liked it, but there was a big petition by the cultural leaders against it. I think Goodhart Rendell was involved in that, an orchestrator of that. So he was, yes, as you say, clearly interested in a kind of modernization of architecture, not a historicism, not a, I suppose, in a way, a pastiche or a kitsch version of replicating the past.
Yes, that's very interesting. I wonder whether he articulated his criticism.
I think it's featured in that book that Bob wrote. I think there is. It's him, and I think the architect of Harlow as well, of the Catholic Church at Harlow, the Gibbard, I think, was involved in the critique as well. But it's Yeah, Goodhart Rendell's
Yeah.
is a really interesting thing. But so this issue around the association with art and this that modernism gets us influenced probably most by the art movement, and art at that time is moving towards abstraction and towards conceptualism, I suppose. And architecture seems to embrace that, and in so doing, could it be suggested, it abandons its role as a generator of normative built environment. So Burnett's point, which is what you do what is contextually appropriate, seems to me to be about generating buildings which are embedded within the kind of vocabulary of the built environment that people expect, want, desire.
Yes. Well,
and rather what modernism does is it flips it all on its head and says, well, you don't know what's good for you. Here, have some concrete. And
yes. I think there are arguments on both sides. I'm a great fence sitter.
A centrist. We need more centrists, so this is good.
Yes. I mean, when you were saying that, I was thinking of the famous Hertfordshire schools, which, have nothing inherently to do with Hertfordshire in their design or construction. And indeed, it was a system that was adopted in all parts of the country and could have been used elsewhere in other places. And yet, one could recognize that they're excellent in many ways. I don't think context is always the right thing. And very often the way to respond to context is to be different. I think that's one of the mistakes in the way that context is interpreted. And yet there is a way of being different in a contextual way, I think. And it's like how you arrange a room and you put discordant objects in it. And in fact, the Architectural Review Timescape campaign had a number of articles in its early stages which made that very analogy that, the thing that's wrong is the one that's right.
No, I know, I do see that. And it's funny when, you go down to Paestum, south of Naples, and you see those 3 Greek temples, which you look at and see as totally embedded within and right for their environment. But they must have looked like spaceships landing when they first came by, when they were first constructed. And there is a funny thing, isn't there, in architecture? Well, certainly within the fields of architecture that are more concerned with tradition, that certain architectural forms, classicism and Gothic, perhaps the two in Western Europe, that are inherently meaningful because they're inherently contextual, and that's not really true, is it?
No, I don't think so. No, I think what's more relevant with those is that they employed masonry construction, which has its own demands, and you end up with limitations on what you can do physically, but also potential for things like surface decoration and the modeling of the surface. And you can move into different materials and do things differently. I think that sort of basis in stone is very significant. It's not the only thing, and there are many architectures that owe almost nothing to it, but that is really the Western, I was going to say bedrock, but that's a bit of a what's the word?
Tautology, yeah.
Tautology, yes.
Well, yeah, I think that's quite interesting. So modernism as an architectural form and its associations with technology mean that because of technology, because of steel and glass, basically, and reinforced concrete, we can supersede a relationship to materials. Materials no longer become important. And so, as a consequence, form no longer becomes important and context becomes universalized. Modernism is a universalist language that is equally relevant to anywhere because the technologies permit it to be relevant to anywhere.
Well, I think that's right. And I think it was when that point was reached, maybe in the first 2 post-war decades, with large-scale adoption of glass curtain walling, that's when the crisis happened. And there was a huge loss of faith in what this was about. And there are many other reasons why that was not a great idea. Can look good. And one can feel quite nostalgic for it even. But it's not over either yet. Admittedly, the curtain walls aren't, on Seagram style slab blocks anymore. They go around corners, but that doesn't really make a difference. There's just looking at the City of London skyline, you think, oh, couldn't they have thought of something different by now?
It's true, actually. That's a very good point. I mean, maybe that's what I was taking the train into Victoria a week or so ago, and going through that disgusting mess that they're making of Battersea. The repulsive buildings. I mean, genuinely awful.
They really are, aren't they? Yes, they really are.
It really does look like, some of them look like they could have been ripped out of a very, very poor estate in sort of Soviet, the farthest flung parts of Soviet Russia or Pyongyang.
Yes.
And yet they're £600,000 for a flat at the same time.
That would be cheap, I think.
Oh, would it? I have no idea.
God, what a mess! What a total mess!
Well,
Somebody needs to write that up. I've been reading an old book by the planning writer Peter Hall called Great Planning Disasters, and it gives me great pleasure. But it needs updating.
Well, it does. We need an Ian Nairn to go round with a sour eye and actually tear into it. Or you perhaps.
Well, no, we've got a few of those. No, a Peter Hall doing what he did. I mean, admittedly, it's not quite comparable, but the Battersea, every possible thing went wrong from the moment it ceased operating as a power station. And I have tracked this quite closely, and there's the result. I mean, weirdly, Bankside Power Station, which never got listed, everything went right.
Yes.
Or more or less.
Yes. I wonder if that's because it happened a bit earlier so one of the things that reading that the essay that you wrote, you talk about the sort of emergence. So you use this word hybridity, and which is a lovely word. It's a lovely idea within architecture that we've kind of, as we've unpacked some of the tropes of modernism, as we've critiqued them or destabilized them or disestablished them, we've been allowed to look at these alternative moderns, people like Harry Goodhart Rendell and Burnett and people like that. And you use some lovely examples from Scandinavia as well. The town hall so I have it on my screen over here at the moment, but the town hall in, where is it? Oslo City Hall, sorry, which is an extraordinary piece of I mean, it's quite a remarkable thing. But this moment where modernism kind of hits the buffers, you get characters like Jane Jacobs rising up, and I wonder whether, to go back to Tate Modern, you have a very well-organized community in Waterloo and Southwark. Obviously, most clearly demonstrated by the Coin Street housing scheme, but it's obviously a very tight community, and one wonders whether they bring to bear, at that time, the voice of the community was becoming preferenced or giving.
No, I can tell you that had absolutely nothing to do with it.
Oh, really?
I was around at the time and played a very small but possibly significant part in bringing Tate Modern to birth in Bankside Power Station.
Wow.
And that was a whole series of things that, by pure fluke, turned out right. And the full story is not really known, I don't think. But
you need to write it up.
It was to do with the fact that the Tate needed a building
Mm.
and had been trying to find a site to build something new, failed, and then this appeared to be available, and Nicholas Sirota saw the point of it, which was not necessarily predictable. In architecturally, it was the wrong image, really, but it did the job. And then also the kind of urban vision that this is very close to the City of London. If you only need a footbridge to kind of join it up, that the River Walk is being strung together, and it really has no hinterland to speak of even now, of a meaningful kind. But the problem with Battersea always was that there was no proper transport there. So anybody who had an idea for the site, the problem always would be, how do you get people in and out? And really, one of the explanations for the mess that's there now is they had to realize enough money to pay for the Northern Line extension that's been built. So they had to overload the site in order to make the payment that they were asked to make towards funding that.
I see. That's quite interesting. But to go back to this idea of, so we have modern architecture. I mean, to come back to that, when I go to London, when I lived in London, when I go to London, I'm always still surprised that it has a centre, and it does have a definitive centre. If you want to go clothes shopping, and you live I lived in Hammersmith at the time, and had friends up in the East End because they were, architects. You still had to go into the West End. And I was kind of baffled by this, a city of 9 million people. And you still had places to, there was nowhere any good. You could go to Primark or whatever in Hammersmith, or Marks and Sparks. But to actually, so partly perhaps Tate Modern's, there's the transportation side of it, but partly because it's where people go when they want to go out. They don't go to Battersea when they want to go out. I mean, why would you go to Battersea?
No, but really, they weren't going to Bagside before it happened.
Okay.
And nobody anticipated the number who would arrive. In the first week, they ran out of loo paper. They just had not realized.
Oh, right. But this idea of the other modern, I want to come back to this idea of the other modern, this hybridity and synthesis, which seems to me you're suggesting that there is, at the beginning of the 20th century, perhaps an uninterrogated or unarticulated, untheorized idea of what later becomes postmodern architecture.
Well, actually, I had a quote in the lecture I gave last week at the University of Kent to that very effect. And it comes from Jean-François Lyotard from La Condition Postmoderne in 1979. And he says, I have to paraphrase it because I can't remember it exactly, but he says something like, postmodernism is not what comes after modernism. It is modernism as it is coming to birth, and the state is constant.
Explain that
and
a bit.
It's very paradoxical, but I love it. I think the first bit of it, that postmodernism precedes modernism, is exactly what you've just said, and I think it's absolutely right. There's a kind of change of mood after 1900, which only 20 years later really gels into what we know as modernism. And without the First World War, that might have been different. And the Scandinavian countries and Britain and America don't really catch up with it. They use a variety of alternatives for another 10 years or more before they decide to fall into line. So that when we get to the postmodernism of the 1970s, and admittedly Lyotard wasn't writing about architecture, it was about philosophy and literature, it is reinvented, but by people who don't really know what they're doing most of the time. That's my kind of regret about it. And then it became a kind of mark of shame, and nobody who was involved even wanted that name applied to them. And we're still slightly in that position where, I think some of the formulations of what postmodernism are very limiting to, very much like the formulations of modernism, in fact, very limiting to what we might potentially see as being part of it. Is Goodhart Rendell postmodern? Is William Whitfield postmodern? Another architect I'm particularly interested in because he kind of crossed the no man's land lines. So I don't know where the problem comes, whether it's a mentality problem, which I think it partly is, of people wanting an identity and then trying to seek a certain kind of consistency within it, or whether it's a personality thing. You are born a modernist or not, which might come down to much the same thing. But I think there's a huge amount of acculturation that goes on. And I don't know whether you'd agree that architects design for each other primarily. Nobody else really counts. It's peer group approval that matters. And there have been long periods in which there are certain things that, you were dead if you even tried to do them. And it happened in schools too. People were failed their degree if they put a pitched roof on a scheme, however justifiable that might have been according to all the rules that were supposed to be the rules of modernism, like practicality.
Yes, I mean, I've even seen that in action. Actually, when I was teaching, there was one particularly not at Kent, but there was one particularly talented designer, undergraduate, extraordinarily virtuosic classical designer, totally native talent, amazing, drew like an angel, and wouldn't stop. And I used to say to them, if you want to make lots of money, carry on doing what you're doing and ignore your tutors. I think he did want to make lots of money, but modules were designed specifically to disable his capacity to do classicism. And it was a kind of Asplund-like classicism. It wasn't, it wasn't kitsch. It was extremely refined and thoughtful, deep work.
Can you think of any other field of creative endeavor in which the Berlin Wall has survived, which is basically what we're talking about? You get shot if you try and cross it.
Yeah. It is funny, isn't it? It is funny, but this comes back to your point about that you just made about the idea of architects designing for each other, and I think that's absolutely true. But they also design for the discipline, and this is something I'm fascinated by: is the idea of professional architecture. In other disciplines, they're aware of the divide between lay and professional knowledges, and professional knowledge is a knowledge that is authorized beyond the community that employs it. And so its validity derives so when the architect walks into the room, their authority actually comes from beyond them. Whereas in lay knowledge and lay practices, the authority is held within the community itself and is validated. And you can see this in vernacular architecture, that the story of vernacular architecture emerges out of the community in a synthetic way and in a interconnected and not a discrete environment. But I wonder with architecture that we've got to this point, or we got to a point. Perhaps this comes to the last part. We got to a point where we were only referencing each other because we were the only people who were also valid in a way. Like our professionalization becomes the problem. And I think this might be true. I think our professional status is a major stumbling block for including discrepant voices, discrepant ideas, alternatives. Dana Cuff writes about this. She writes about how in architecture, radicalism and avant-gardism is a permitted characteristic of the center. So your enfants terribles are permitted to do things which critique the center on the assumption that they will be incorporated into the canon, and therefore they will be sort of disciplined or socialized into the kind of into the canon. They will be made good in a way. They will be made modern, I suppose.
Well, that did happen. I'm not sure when that piece would have been written, but I wonder whether that's over. I very much hope it is.
Mm.
And I gained some sort of optimism from the fact that the star architects who were around 20 years ago don't really count for very much anymore. And they may have had something going for them, but they were so overinflated. I think particularly of Daniel Libeskind. Each building was more a parody of the one before and seemed to add nothing new. There was clearly, I think it's unethical in so many different ways to work that way. And I think the conscience of architects reawoke within the same period, but with very different results. And perhaps merely reviving an older Puritanism. But I'm more hopeful about where we are now, actually, and the social engagement of architects that has been a feature of some earlier periods has actually kind of found its locus. And where I teach at the London School of Architecture, this is very much the genre. I think there's something still missing, which is understanding, how you can make a building that is good on its own terms, regardless of what you think it's going to do for people's welfare. And that's the danger of concentrating so much on, we've got to go and save these people from whatever it is with our architecture. So we seem fated never quite to get it in balance, but designing what I would call a good building, not everybody's got it. And certainly not everybody who comes into the profession has got it. What worries me is that a lot of people no longer know what it is or want to recognize that there could be such a thing because it's hierarchical and divisive and so on.
I mean, that's quite interesting. That's quite an interesting idea that you get a kind of reaction against this idea of an ethical architecture has a ghost, if not a ghost, then a very, very deep shadow of what's the word I'm looking for? It's not colonialism per se, but it's kind of architecture that's good for you. This idea that there's a group of people who, through their training and their professional status, know how you should live. And obviously, the frilly stuff of the late 20th century, post 68 generation, really, is a kind of reaction against that didactic, moralistic quality that you see in the Smithson's work, that you see in the LCC work, and so we've come back to this idea of architecture. Well, we're now trying to be moralistic, but we're trying to do it by co-opting communities to justify our moralism in a peculiar kind of way.
I suppose so. Yes. Oh God, it's complicated. Yes, it's a kind of the lecture I gave last week. I looked up the 1980 Venice Biennale Presents of the Past catalogue, and the opening essay by Paolo Portoghese is called "The End of Prohibitionism." And it's quite a good title and a good word, I think. Prohibitionism has been very rife. It's a very nice thing to have, because you're right and everybody else is wrong. But I also quoted Sir Toby Belch in Twelfth Night, saying to Malvolio, "Dost thou think because thou art virtuous, there shall be no more cakes and ale?" And I think that's very applicable.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. But the impurity that you talk about is not a value judgment, and it's certainly not a criticism. It's a good thing that we're starting to see an opening out of this kind of color and new languages and the adoption of, I suppose, diverse ideas, which is good.
That's what I'm for. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what is the future of modernism if this is what you're noting? Because my gut feeling is that this is the case. This is what is going to happen, whether the profession of architecture wants it to or not. That there's a kind of polyphony emerging in the background that comes from a kind of just material reality, the fact that we have an incredibly culturally diverse populations in countries now, and they're looking for representation of recognition and rights in relation to their in relation to their own community identities, personal individual identities, and so on.
Yes, and I think there are parts of the world where if it's penetrated, it's been, something very other, and there's still as you're suggesting, a sort of indigenous. In other places, in Britain, for example, I think the indigenous, if there was one, and there was, it's quite hard to bring it back to life. You can create a sort of simulacrum of it, and it's being built all over the country, but with no real life in it at all, which is sad given the amount of kind of really dreary stuff that is being poured out, and it doesn't take much to get it right. Another practice I wrote about, Taylor and Green in Norfolk, in the 1950s and 60s, building their council houses, were using very standard materials. Partly the virtue of their work was in the layout plans and how they grouped the houses in relation to existing trees and so on, and partly in getting those very precise spacing of windows and so on exactly right, which is something one can't really kind of prove to anybody. It's my eye against somebody else's, but I think they did it.
Yes, it's a really interesting one. I mean, I was thinking earlier when you were talking, I was thinking about this idea of postmodernism kind of getting it a little bit wrong. My gut feeling about that, and what reading around the redevelopment of London Docklands under the Thatcher government in the 1980s and 90s, Tory government anyway, and then into the 90s, under the finishing under New Labour, is that what postmodernism looks like is an architectural culture running after mainstream taste. That they try and turn it up to 11 in that kind of Spinal Tap-ish way, but ultimately they're being led by the market, and the market is all for a kind of historicism, a modernized historicism or something. I'm not quite sure what a synthetic vernacular, kind of somewhere between the two, and so you get these kind of set pieces in London Docklands by the big architects of that period, Ian Ritchie's and Rogers and CZWG and so on. But really, what they seem to be parroting is in fact suburbia.
Well, that's thought.
Is that suburbia is the dominant?
Got our heads around what was going on in the early 90s yet.
No.
It was a kind of carnival in a way, and if one believes in pluralism, and I think I have to, that's where you can see it. Whether anybody did anything really good there, I doubt, but it worked in its funny way.
It did.
And to me, the lesson to take away is we could do the same, but we could do it better.
Yes. Yeah, it's Bruno Latour's point about pluralism. He says pluralism is our only defense against fundamentalism. And I think architectural discourse, perhaps, or practice maybe, has been characterized by a sort of fundamentalism, which has reified certain visions of modernism, which become the bellwethers or become the measurement by which all architecture is adjudged, and you deviate from that at your peril. But perhaps pluralism, but a genuine pluralistic architecture perhaps it looks like Docklands, perhaps it looks like a mess, and perhaps what architecture needs to get its head around is that the future is a bit of a mess. It's less Haussmann and it's more Vegas.
Yeah, I mean, it's bound to be. I think there is deep down, something quite profound there. And you mentioned Jane Jacobs earlier, and I think her great insight was to understand mess, which is sort of what she said about a street that works. From the outside, it's chaotic, but actually it's an organized chaos, and you have to just get in there and see it closer up. Now, I don't think that's quite what you meant about the variety of different building styles, but you could say it's a spread bet. If some of them don't work out, you might win on some others.
Yes, and time will erase the bad ones, and we'll be left looking back.
That's what you think. No, time erases the good ones more often than not.
Well, they're probably built on the best sites, you see. So then the commercial value of the land is just so incredibly high. But I like this idea of looking at modernism and looking at, there was a wonderful book called Ordinary Cities by a sociologist called Jennifer Robinson about modernism, Arjun Appadurai's idea of modernism at large, or modernity at large, where actually, if you go to the global south or you go to the less economically developed countries, you will find a form of modernism which is just as modern. And that the modern project wasn't so much a Western European baby as it was a kind of, I suppose it's a technological, I suppose we come back to this thing. Is it just to do with technology? And that ultimately, once you adopt the technologies of modernism, you are modern.
Yes.
Isn't that what it's all about?
No, well, not according to the style police, you're not.
No.
You can have your steel frame and clad it in something that will send you to prison. But fundamentally, yes. I think modernity is a very valid concept. I don't think modernism is.
Your book, 100 Years of Architecture, does that? You mentioned that in the article. Is the idea of that to start kind of breaking open the story? Because one of the things that you mentioned in the paper, one of the things you talk about is the kind of evolutionary principle, which sees architecture as this kind of eternally progressing thing in that Bannister Fletcher kind of way of the tree of architecture going up from geology all the way through
well, I call it Charles Jenks kind of way, really. No.
Well, he does, yeah. His is still evolutionary, isn't it?
Well, it has many strands, but it is very time based.
Yeah.
And I've always been rather suspicious of that. I suppose, having been taught by David Watkin, who didn't follow his own commandments, but I think time is relatively unimportant. And what comes after what, I see things more in a kind of circular fashion. As for the book, I don't think I thought about it that much, but I thought, this is a great opportunity. Nobody's policing me or telling me what to do, I will allocate, maybe about 20% of the book to the, the known territory, because I can't leave that out, and I don't intend to. But I want to look for representative buildings, partly under different themes, and that's the way it's organized, and in as wide a variety of countries as I can use. And so I was, determined to get a building from Romania, for example, and one from Estonia. I didn't always succeed, and it's probably partly my ignorance that I don't know what's there.
Yeah.
But what did strike me, and this was fascinating because it's kind of reflection of the way things are. While you could get 200 different images of a famous modern building, let's say Villa Savoye, from different photographers, you couldn't get a single one of some of these other buildings. Or maybe there was just one, but you had to find that one photographer and get him to release the rights. And so, it's very unequally weighted in terms of the visual information. And stuff that's been in books. I published in that book, I published, I would say, nearly 100 buildings that had never been in a book before. But I should like to think so. They might have been in a magazine.
It's amazing, isn't it? Yes, it's a funny narrow discipline in that respect. I suppose it's such a diverse discipline that it has to carefully curate its palette, lest we become kind of overwhelmed.
I don't think there's any conscious kind of decision behind that. I think it's sheer laziness, and then sort of continuous reinforcement loop.
Yeah,
we think this is good, therefore it's good, and therefore we think it's good. And even if we don't think it's good, we still have to talk about it.
Yes. I mean, there is another thing, of course, and you mentioned this at the very beginning of when we were talking, this idea of modernism really being based about enjoyment and what it looks like and the kind of visceral experience of it. And you get, you look at Le Corbusier's work and it's visceral, it's almost undeniable. You look at Mises' towers and they're phenomenal. They're like forces of nature. And then you look at the little stuff up in Norfolk you were mentioning, you're like, well, if modern architecture can do this, shall we bother with this?
Absolutely, yes, because New York and Norfolk are, there's a bit of a difference. Although interestingly, Herbert Taylor of Taylor and Green was reviewing some book and said, people make these divisions in architecture, but he said, I think time will tell that it's all one stream, albeit rather a muddy one, or words to that effect. And I like that. It's just our kind of blindness that means that we can't see the connections.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to end on. The muddy stream of modern architecture. Very beautiful. Okay, well, thank you. How charming was that, hey? Thank you to the ever-elegant Alan for submitting to my ignorance. Please see the podcast description for links to his profile and the text we discussed. And of course, do please like, share, follow, subscribe. Here's for Architecture. Cheers. How charming was that, hey? Thank you to the ever-elegant Alan for submitting to my ignorance. Please see the podcast description for links to his profile and the text we discussed. And of course, do please like, share, follow, subscribe. Ears for Architecture. Cheers.